So, 4 years ago, on the 24th of February 2022, Russia invaded Ukraine, and many experts were convinced that it would be a quick victory, lasting a few weeks, maybe a couple of months. Then, after a few months, in September, many of those experts were saying that it was Ukraine's time to win. A lot of people thought that they had it in the bag. But as Mike Tyson once said, everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face. Before I attempt to answer the question on who's currently winning the war, what does winning even mean? Well, according to The Art of War by Sun Tzu, winning doesn't just mean defeating the enemy in battle. Through strategy, deception, and superior positioning, the true victory lies in crippling your opponent's resources, ensuring they cannot recover or retaliate. With that in mind, we will look at these 4 points of the conflict to get an understanding of who's actually winning. And no, I won't cover infantry losses since there's no clear consensus, just random numbers being thrown around by each side. In the morning of February the 24th, 2022, nearly 200,000 Russian soldiers invaded from Belarus to target Kiev, and from the northeast against the city of Kharkov. The southeastern front was conducted as two separate spearheads, from Crimea in the south and Lugansk and Donetsk in the east. Since then, several operational and strategic successes for both sides can be observed up until today. The failure of Russia's attempt to capture Kiev and the successful Ukrainian defense and counteroffensives are best categorized as strategic successes for Ukraine. The fall of Kiev would likely have resulted in a regime change and a major shift in the war. Ukraine's ability to hold the capital ensured its continued sovereignty. Furthermore, the failure of Russia's northeastern offensive, particularly in Chernihiv and Sumy, represents an operational success for Ukraine. Ukraine successfully resisted Russian advances, preventing them from securing key cities that could have been used as staging grounds for a deeper push into central Ukraine. Russia's southern campaign, particularly the capture of Mariupol and the land bridge to Crimea, represents a strategic success, strengthening its logistical position and territorial control. By capturing key cities and road networks, Russia established the land bridge to Crimea, securing a continuous supply route and reducing reliance on the Kerch Bridge, while also restoring Crimea's water supply by seizing the North Crimean Canal in Novakhovka. The capture of the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant also gave Russia leverage over Ukraine's energy infrastructure. On top of that, the fall of Mariupol ensured full control of the Sea of Azov, eliminating Ukraine's presence there. In the eastern front, both sides had operational successes. Russia captured key supply hubs like Izium, while Ukraine successfully repelled and disrupted Russian advances towards the key city of Kharkov. However, neither side fully achieved their strategic objectives on the eastern front during the early phase of the war. Ukraine's surprise Kharkov counteroffensive in early September around Balakleya and Kharkov was a decisive operational success, forcing Russia to retreat from several key positions in the region. The operation led to the capture of large swaths of territory and created a massive blow to Russian morale. In response to these setbacks, Russia announced a partial mobilization on the 21st of September 2022, calling up to 300,000 reservists in a bid to bolster its forces. Similarly, the Kherson counteroffensive, which spanned from August to November 2022, marked a significant operational success for Ukraine, straining Russian supplies to the city of Kherson and eventually culminating in the recapture of Kherson city, the only regional capital that Russia had captured since the start of the war. Ukraine's success in Kherson ensured that Russia was no longer able to advance on Odessa or sever Ukraine's access to the Black Sea, a key strategic and economic resource. The winter stalemate of late 2022 to early 2023 saw both sides entrenched with limited movement. After the stalemate, the Battle of Bakhmut took place, and it could be best categorized as an operational success for Russia, given the eventual capture of the city after months of intense combat. Despite both sides facing heavy casualties and the tens of thousands, the prolonged nature of the battle allowed Russia to drain resources and manpower from Ukraine, forcing the country to focus significant efforts on defending Bakhmut and its immediate surroundings. 2023 Ukrainian failed summer counteroffensive can be best considered an operational success for Russia. Russia held its lines in Donetsk, Zaporozhye and other key regions despite Ukrainian attempts to break through. The slow pace of Ukraine's advances and heavy resistance allowed Russia to avoid losing significant territory, with Western tanks also suffering heavy losses, proving that advanced military technology alone could not overcome entrenched defenses. The Battle of Avdiivka in February 2024 was an operational success for Russia, as it was able to capture a key Ukrainian stronghold and significantly expand its territorial control. Avdiivka had been one of Ukraine's best defended and most fortified positions since 2014, and its loss marked a significant shift in the front lines. Other battles in the conflict, like Lysychansk, Liman, or Velika Novoselivka, are part of larger offensives and can be counted as tactical successes. That's why they have not been mentioned on the list. As of February the 24th, 2025, 4 years later, 3 large-scale battles are still ongoing around the front lines: Pokrovsk, Kursk, and around the Toretsk Chasov Yar localities. These battles are still unfolding and their outcomes remain uncertain as both sides continue to clash fiercely. In total, both sides have had 1 strategic success and 4 operational successes. But this tally may change in a few months if Russia is able to capture Pokrovsk and Chasov Yar, or if Ukraine strengthens its position around Kursk and fully halts Russian advances to recapture the region. If you also count military successes at sea, Ukraine forced Russia to abandon its blockade, especially after sinking the Moskva, hindering Russian control of Black Sea routes. As we established earlier, the situation at the front line is not the only determining factor of who's winning the conflict. You can win all battles but still lose a war. Economic warfare is a key part of crippling your opponent's resources. Before Russia invaded Ukraine on February 24, 2022, the world was recovering from the economic disruptions of the COVID-19 pandemic, with optimism for global growth and GDP projected to rise. However, after the invasion, many Western countries in the global north, including the US, the UK, EU and others, imposed sanctions on Russia to weaken its economy and force an end to its invasion. Key sanctions included blocking Russian banks from SWIFT, halting Nord Stream 2, restricting exports of military technology, restricting visas for Russian individuals, and freezing $300 billion worth of Russian financial assets. These severe sanctions harmed the Russian economy but raised concerns about potential Russian retaliation and its impact on the global economy. Russia reacted to the international sanctions by taking some calculated measures. Russia implemented countermeasures to mitigate sanctions, including requiring energy payments in rubles, pegging the ruble to gold, increasing interest rates, and restricting foreign investors from selling Russian assets. It also banned exports of key goods, nationalized foreign companies, cut off food and fertilizer exports to hostile nations, and offered to buy back Eurobonds in rubles to reduce the reliance on the US dollar. The result of this was clear. Oil prices surged to $100 per barrel as Europe's energy shortage worsened due to sanctions on Russia, the world's second largest oil producer. Monthly inflation rate increased in many countries outside the conflict. The rise in inflation increased the cost of living. In the UK, for instance, the inflation rate rose to 9.1% in 2022 and 7.3% in 2023, implying that consumers spent more money on fewer goods. Inflation rate in Russia was worse, at 13.75% in 2022 and 5.86% in 2023. However, the inflation rate in Ukraine was absolutely crippling. Ukraine suffered an inflation rate of 20.18% in 2022 and 12.85% in 2023. This is worse than Somalia and the Central African Republic, which have been unstable for several years. Export halts from Russia and Ukraine, which are key suppliers of wheat, fertilizer and grains, severely impacted African food security, driving up prices in countries like Egypt, Sudan and Tunisia, leading to protests and unrest. For example, bread prices in Egypt jumped by 25% in 2022, however they have now quadrupled since. In Sri Lanka, rising food and fuel costs contributed to mass protests that led to the president's resignation. All of this caused Ukraine's GDP, based on purchasing power parity, drop by 23.7% in 2022, only slightly improving by 9% in 2023, though nowhere near its pre-conflict levels. The huge demographic crisis that the country is facing has only made the situation worse. What's even worse is that the new Trump administration has asked for at least $500 billion back in the form of half of Ukraine's resources. Which, I don't even know where Trump got his number from. I think he made it up on the spot. Zelensky has so far denied his offer though on multiple occasions. And yeah, why would you ever accept that? Russia though, despite being cut off from its main revenue sources in Europe and tons of Western companies leaving the Russian market, managed to quickly adapt to the sanctions, and it became the 4th largest economy in the world and the largest in Europe in terms of GDP in 2022. And speaking of Russia's resilience, Moscow just got a major financial boost. 570 billion rubles were unfrozen in 2024, amounting to about $6.3 billion US. However, this may be a one-time occurrence. If the IMF forecast for 2024 is correct, the Russian economy would have grown by 20.6% since the start of the conflict, up to nearly $7 trillion in purchasing power parity. From what we know now, the Russian economy shows no sign of slowing down, and it is clear that they have an edge over Ukraine in the economic war. In The Art of War, Sun Tzu famously said, "All warfare is based on deception," reflecting how influencing public perception and using propaganda can shape outcomes, much like how deception in warfare can mislead opponents and control narratives. Since Russia's invasion of Ukraine, both Moscow and Kiev have been accused of using propaganda to influence public opinion, with Russia focusing on defamation, claiming Ukraine is committing genocide against Russians and is aligned with Nazis. Meanwhile, Ukraine has effectively used guilt and outrage to garner Western support, and both sides have engaged in intense propaganda campaigns alongside their military efforts. So who's actually winning the propaganda front of the war? While Russian claims of great victories against Ukrainian Nazis may be regarded as laughable in the West, researchers say that these tactics have proved highly effective within Russia and among Russian allies. Images of Ukrainian Viking symbol hobbyists have not helped Ukraine. Ukrainian supporters used photos from other conflicts, movies, and video games as evidence of Russian attacks, with some narratives being spread by government sources, such as the debunked story of the Ghost of Kiev. A fighter pilot claimed to have shot down at least 10 Russian jets. However, the Ukrainian government itself took a different approach. Zelensky's efforts at guilt-tripping the West resulted in one of the biggest shifts in military material to another country in history. His team managed to convince countries like Germany, which initially started by sending helmets, to become Ukraine's second biggest supporter by sending German Leopard 2 tanks. Furthermore, at the start of the conflict, Zelensky himself brought up an image of the brave Ukrainian, helping with recruitment efforts as well as morale. Behind the scenes though, the Ukrainian government banned all men aged 18 to 60 from leaving the country, instead instructing them to report for duty at the military recruitment office. Today, the attitude towards Zelensky has changed. Despite initial claims that Ukraine won the propaganda war at the start, there have been rumors for a while about Western allies being annoyed at Zelensky and wanting to replace him. And now, with Ukraine being left out of key negotiations, the public perception is breaking down even more, and frustration is boiling over between America and Ukraine. We'll get into that more soon though. What's worse, at home President Zelensky's popularity has crashed, with only 16% of Ukrainians willing to re-elect him for a second term, according to a recent poll of 1,200 people, though this rating is debatable. Some Ukrainian soldiers are worn out from the years of war and feel that a bad peace would be preferable to continuing the conflict, as many new recruits are forced into vans and lack the motivation and experience needed for real combat. Though there's less information about how Russian soldiers feel, the fact that many are still willing to sign up to fight for the large financial incentives is a positive sign for Russia. The Ukrainian military has also faced several corruption scandals, raising questions about Western aid funds. Despite all of this, most European states are still standing behind Ukraine. However, the winner of the propaganda war will only be determined by how the new Trump administration decides to deal with Russia, as America remains Ukraine's most important supporter. Sun Tzu famously said, "The skillful leader subdues the enemy without fighting." This leaves us with the global chessboard, the current diplomatic and geopolitical state of the world. After Russia invaded Ukraine, the global north and west formed what looked like an overwhelming global coalition. 141 countries supported a United Nations measure demanding that Russia unconditionally withdraw. By contrast, at the time, Russia seemed completely isolated. North Korea was one of 4 countries that backed Russia and rejected the measure. But the West never won over as much of the world as it initially seemed. Another 47 countries abstained or missed the vote, including India and China. Many of those neutral nations have since provided crucial economic or diplomatic support for Russia. And even some of the nations that initially agreed to denounce Russia see the war as somebody else's problem, and have since moved towards a more neutral position. In October 2024, it became evident that the West had failed to completely isolate Russia, as 36 leaders from countries such as India, China, Egypt, and the UAE attended the BRICS summit in Russia. The summit also highlighted a shift in the geopolitical balance, with Russia taking steps to unite the global south against the US-dominated global north. When it comes to Ukraine, they officially applied for EU membership less than a week after Russia invaded in February 2022. Ukraine also applied for NATO membership in September 2022 after Russia proclaimed that it had annexed the country's southeast. However, after the Munich Security Conference just a few weeks ago in February 2025, the new Trump administration has openly ruled out NATO membership for Ukraine, calling it unrealistic. Furthermore, several EU states have expressed concerns or oppositions to Ukraine's membership. Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, Bulgaria, and Romania have all expressed concerns about Ukraine's EU membership, mainly due to the economic strain, competition in agriculture, and the redistribution of EU funds. However, as the US has started sidelining Ukraine under the new Trump administration, EU support for Ukraine has become even more vocal, with many leaders in Europe calling to create their own path separate from the United States. Compared to the start of the conflict, Russia has proven more resilient to diplomatic isolation than many in the West anticipated. On February the 18th, 2025, the US and Russia sat down for high-stakes talks, and for the first time the US agreed to work towards ending the war in Ukraine. But here's the kicker, Ukraine wasn't even invited. The US and Russia and Saudi Arabia talking about Ukraine's future without Ukraine. A remarkable shift that ends Russia's diplomatic isolation and signals that, like it or not, most of the world is moving on. You know who's not happy about that? Zelensky. He's furious that Ukraine wasn't invited to these talks, and that kicked off a major spat between him and Trump.
But today I heard, oh, well, we weren't invited. Well, you've been there for 3 years. You should have ended it 3 years. You should have never started it. You could have made a deal.
In response to this, Zelensky said that Trump is living in a Russian disinformation bubble. And this made Trump even angrier.
A dictator without elections. Zelensky better move fast or he's not going to have a country left. Gotta move fast.
Trump also then threw in a jab about Ukraine being a modestly successful comedian who talked the US into spending $350 billion on a war that couldn't be won. Although the rift between Trump and Zelensky is becoming worse by the day, Russia has still not made any concrete deals with the Americans. If Russia can secure a deal that lifts US sanctions without Europe or Ukraine's involvement, it would mark a significant victory for them in this geopolitical conflict. Having examined these 4 principles outlined by Sun Tzu, it's becoming increasingly evident which side is gaining an upper hand, even if the ultimate outcome is still uncertain. Yes, Russia has failed to fully cripple Ukraine's resources, preventing them from being unable to recover or retaliate. In fact, Ukrainian commanders have done a very good job so far for the huge pressure they're facing, and many Russian generals have admitted this. However, though slowly, the front line still appears to be shifting in Russia's favor from what we're seeing. And the head of Ukraine's armed forces, Syrskyi, has himself said that the war cannot be won by only defending. Additionally, Russia seems to have gained the upper hand in the economic aspects of the conflict. But the most crucial aspect of the conflict, the global chessboard, remains uncertain. The ultimate winner, whether it's Ukraine or Russia, will also depend on how the US chooses to act in the coming months. At the end of the day, whilst the global north is busy fighting each other into the ground, the true winner of this conflict has already been decided.
解放，正义翻身。